Ready to dive into some seriously challenging ideas about cancer?
I'm game if you are.
Let's do it. We're looking at this interview with Dr. Thomas Seyfried, a cancer researcher.
Oh, yeah, I've seen this guy.
He was on that YouTube channel, The Diary of a CEO.
Right.
The video is called The Groundbreaking Cancer Expert.
Yeah.
New research. This common food is making cancer worse.
Catchy title.
Definitely gets your attention. And we should say right off the bat, some of his claims are controversial. But if even half of what he's saying is true, it could completely change how we think about cancer risk and prevention.
Yeah, he doesn't pull any punches.
So to kick things off, Dr. Seyfried's central argument is this. Cancer isn't primarily a genetic disease,
Okay.
but a metabolic one.
Interesting.
It's all about how cells produce energy.
And that, of course, is a very different way of looking at it than I think a lot of people in the field do now.
It really is. So to understand why this is such a radical idea, it helps to know a bit about Dr. Seyfried's background. He's a professor of biology at Boston College, and he's been researching cancer for over 30 years. Now, his argument hinges on something called the Warburg effect.
Okay, the Warburg effect. Now remind me.
So the Warburg effect was discovered in the 1920s.
Way back.
Way back. And it describes how cancer cells favor an inefficient method of energy production called fermentation, even when oxygen is readily available.
So, in a nutshell, it's kind of like using a horse and buggy in the age of the Tesla. Fermentation is this old process, one that was around even before there was a lot of oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere.
So cancer cells are using this outdated technology, which kind of makes you wonder, why would they do that?
That is the question. And Dr. Seyfried believes the answer is in something called mitochondrial dysfunction. So mitochondria, as you probably know, are like the powerhouses of our cells. They take food and turn it into usable energy.
Right, the tiny little power plants.
Exactly. So if they're damaged or not working as they should,
Then what happens?
well, cells are kind of forced to rely on that less efficient fermentation process.
Okay, so the damaged mitochondria could be the root cause. What kinds of things cause the damage in the first place?
Well, Dr. Seyfried points to a bunch of different things, and some of them are kind of surprising. Stress, not getting enough sleep, environmental toxins. Basically, he argues that all these things can damage our mitochondria.
So even if you're doing everything else right, you're eating all your fruits and veggies, exercising, you're saying there's all this other stuff in modern life that could be upping our risk.
It's a lot to think about. And remember those kind of inefficient energy pathways we talked about, the ones that rely on fermentation?
Right.
Well, they have a particular fondness for two key fuels, glucose, which we get from carbohydrates,
Yeah.
and an amino acid called glutamine.
So Dr. Seyfried thinks if you restrict these fuels, you could essentially starve the cancer cells.
That's the idea. Now, here's the really interesting part. Healthy cells can actually adapt to using ketones for energy.
Wait, ketones, like the ketogenic diet.
That's the one. And Dr. Seyfried believes that our ancestors, who often had diets that were very low in carbohydrates and high in fat, they were in ketosis a lot of the time. And guess what? Cancer was far less common then.
So there's an evolutionary argument here, like our bodies are better suited to a different way of eating.
That's exactly what Dr. Seyfried is suggesting, yeah. He actually draws this really interesting parallel between humans and chimpanzees.
Okay.
So, did you know there's never been a documented case of breast cancer in a female chimpanzee?
Really? Wow. But they're genetically very similar to us, aren't they?
They are, and that's why Dr. Seyfried thinks diet plays a far more significant role than we've maybe been led to believe.
This is all starting to make sense. But what kind of evidence does Dr. Seyfried have to back these claims up?
Yeah.
Because he's making some pretty bold statements.
He is, but he's done a ton of research, including animal studies, that show a direct link between blood sugar levels and tumor growth.
So the higher the blood sugar, the faster the tumor grows.
That's what he's found. He even points to global cancer trends as more evidence for his theories. Like, did you know that early onset cancer, meaning cancer diagnosed before the age of 50, has skyrocketed something like 80% since 1990?
80%.
80%. And this is despite huge amounts of funding and research into the genetic side of cancer.
That is alarming. Makes you wonder if we're missing a big piece of the puzzle.
And that's what Dr. Seyfried is saying. He thinks that missing piece is this metabolic approach. And he has some pretty compelling human examples that seem to support his theory.
Like who? Tell me about some of those.
One of the most interesting cases is this guy, Pablo Kelly. He's a young man from England who was diagnosed with a really aggressive brain tumor, like back in 2014.
Yeah, this is the case Dr. Seyfried talks about in the interview, right? Where the doctors only gave him like a year to live.
Yep, that's the one. Even with surgery and radiation and chemo, they said he had just over a year.
Wow.
But Pablo had been researching Dr. Seyfried's work, and he was really determined to try this whole metabolic approach.
So he just completely disregarded what the doctors were recommending.
It was a huge decision, but he worked with his doctors to monitor something called his glucose ketone index. It's also called GKI. Basically, it's a way to measure how much your body is using ketones for fuel.
Okay, so this GKI, how does that tie in with everything else we've been talking about?
So remember how Dr. Seyfried believes our ancestors were in ketosis a lot of the time?
Right.
Well, a low GKI means you're in that metabolic Paleolithic zone. Basically, you're mimicking the energy state of those hunter-gatherer ancestors who very rarely got cancer.
So it's like a measure of how aligned you are with your ancient metabolic programming or something.
Yeah, you could put it that way.
Yeah.
And so by keeping his GKI low, Pablo was able to slow down the growth of the tumor, like significant. He actually ended up living for another 10 years after his diagnosis.
Wow.
Yeah.
Instead of 1 year, he got 10 more years. That's incredible.
It's a really powerful story
It is.
about this idea of like taking control of your own health, even when you're facing a really scary diagnosis.
You mentioned that he worked with his doctors. So it sounds like Dr. Seyfried's approach isn't necessarily about rejecting conventional medicine entirely, is it?
Not at all. Dr. Seyfried actually sees metabolic therapy as something that can work in conjunction with other treatments. In fact, he thinks chemo can be even more effective when the body's in ketosis.
More effective.
Yeah, because when you deprive cancer cells of that glucose, you're basically making them more vulnerable to the toxic effects of the chemo.
Oh, that's interesting.
There's even some research that shows that ketones might actually protect healthy cells from some of those harsh chemo side effects.
So it's not about ditching chemo altogether. It's about maybe helping it work better and with fewer side effects, which would be huge if it turns out to be true. So what kinds of things does Dr. Seyfried recommend in terms of lifestyle changes if someone wants to try to get some of these benefits?
It's important to emphasize that we are not doctors and we are not giving medical advice here.
Of course.
But broadly speaking, Dr. Seyfried advocates for a lifestyle that's more in line with what our ancestors would have experienced. Regular exercise, not eating too many calories, and eating a diet that's naturally lower in carbs.
And he's a big proponent of intermittent fasting as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. For him, fasting is about more than just losing weight. It's like a way to reset your metabolism, like hitting the reset button on how your cells are functioning.
And he talked about those keto meters too, like as a way to track your progress.
Right. He's all about monitoring your GKI. He actually believes that everybody, not just people who have cancer, can benefit from understanding their metabolic state.
So it's more about being proactive, taking
Yeah.
control of your health before something like cancer develops.
Exactly. And if you're already dealing with a cancer diagnosis, it gives you a sense of control, like
Yeah.
you can actively participate in your own healing.
Right. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. I mean, it's kind of overwhelming too when you realize how much our modern lifestyle is working against us.
It is. But what I find so hopeful about Dr. Seyfried's work is that he truly believes that cancer is preventable, and that by understanding how our metabolism works, we can actually empower ourselves to live longer, healthier lives.
That's a great message. But his ideas have been met with some pushback, haven't they? Like he's gotten some resistance from the medical establishment.
For sure. And he's been pretty critical of what he sees as an overemphasis on funding and research for genetics when the metabolic side of things is being neglected.
He believes this is actually holding back progress.
Absolutely. And he feels a sense of urgency about it, because cancer rates are going up, especially early onset cancers. He feels like we don't have time to wait. We need to be exploring every avenue, even the ones that challenge the way we've always thought about things.
I get it. It's like he's saying we've got these tools, all this knowledge, and we're just not using them.
Yeah, and the potential here is huge. I mean, he's talking about a future where metabolic therapy is just part of standard cancer care.
So not just chemo, not just surgery, but really looking at the whole picture.
Exactly. So instead of this like one-size-fits-all approach, treatment is tailored to each person, based on their own metabolic profile.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, we're seeing that in other areas of healthcare, so why not cancer treatment too? It's about time, right?
He thinks so. And for Dr. Seyfried, I mean, that's got to be what keeps him going.
Yeah.
Seeing these patients respond to this approach, knowing he's actually making a difference in their lives.
You can tell he's really passionate about it, and that's always inspiring to see. It reminds you that one person really can make a difference even when they're facing a lot of pushback.
Totally. He's a good reminder that progress means challenging the way things have always been done, you know? We have to be willing to question what we think we know and be open to these new possibilities.
Basically, follow the science, even if it leads you to some uncomfortable places.
Yeah, and especially with something as complex and as devastating as cancer is, we need people who are willing to do that to keep pushing the boundaries.
For sure. So, if anyone listening is feeling a little overwhelmed by all this, just remember that knowledge really is power. Like, the more we learn about how our bodies actually work, I mean, at a fundamental level, the better equipped we are to make choices that support our health.
And don't be afraid to start small, even if it's just incorporating one or two of the things that Dr. Seyfried talks about, like maybe cutting back on sugar a little or trying out intermittent fasting, just being a bit more mindful of stress. Those things can make a big difference over time.
It's about taking that first step, and then another one, and then another. Eventually, you've built a lifestyle that actually supports your health. You know, your body wants to be healthy.
It does.
And you never know, you might inspire some people around you to make some changes too.
Now, that would be a real testament to Dr. Seyfried and all the work that he's done.
It would. So one last thought before we wrap up. We've been talking about how much our everyday choices might influence our risk for cancer. So my question for everyone listening is, what's the one change that stands out to you the most? What feels like the most impactful place to start? Maybe something to reflect on as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.